Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. Blackout Week continues on the Power Hungry Podcast. This is a podcast where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And the Texas Blackouts, you might have heard, involve a lot of energy, a lot of power, and a lot of politics. And for those reasons, I'm pleased to introduce my guest and friend, Bill Peacock, who is the Policy Director at the Energy Alliance. Bill, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Robert. I really appreciate it.
Glad you could make time. Bill, you've been following energy policy in Texas for a long time, but I warned you that I'm going to have you introduce yourself. So if you don't mind, imagine you just arrived at a very fancy dinner party with lots of important people, and you have 35 or 40 seconds to introduce yourself. Please, by all means, tell us who you are.
Thanks. Well, I've been working in and around Texas government since 1989, Texas legislature, state agencies. And for most of the last 16, 17 years, I was at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And from 2005 until I left back in 2019 or 2020, I was working on energy policy there, focusing a lot on renewables, but just the competitive market of the grid. Because as you know, Texas has the most competitive electricity market in the world. So just been doing that for a long time, along with other issues. And then I'm with the Energy Alliance now. You can find us at energyalliance.com. And we've been focusing on energy, both here in Texas and nationwide, and how to have a secure, affordable, and reliable electric grid.
Great. And just to be clear, the Energy Alliance is a project of the Texas Business Council, the Texas Business Coalition.
Correct.
Okay. So let's jump right in. Thanks for that introduction. So you've been in and around energy policy now for 30 years, and you've had a particular focus on renewables. Let me just ask the question I put to many of the guests on Blackout Week. Why did Texas have blackouts?
Well, I've been asked that question a lot. I was up in Parker County just last Friday, and I gave my presentation, and after I'd given about a 15-minute presentation, somebody from the audience asked me, "So can you tell me why the Texas blackouts occurred?" So I thought I'd covered that in the presentation, but that made me realize I need to focus up. And I'd really say two big things: overzealous, fearful regulators who can't keep their hands off the market, and crony corporatism. Those are the two big issues out there. And we could go into what each one of those has contributed to the blackouts.
Well, let's start with the second one. You said crony corporatism. Crony capitalism is the term that I hear more often.
Right.
And we can talk about the regulators, and we know that Bill Magnus was just fired by ERCOT. But let's explore that. What's crony capitalism? Why is crony capitalism to blame here? What role did that play, and how did that manifest itself?
Right. Well, sometimes I use the term corporate or crony corporatism because I don't want people to get confused to think that capitalism is a bad thing. And we see more and more of that in our society today. But if you modify it with corporate capitalism and just make sure it's not capitalism that's causing the problem, that's okay. Another way to look at this is corporate welfare. So the reason for that is that for years now, the regulators and the generators and the transmission folks have come to this place where everything's more comfortable and agreeable to them if they work together. And there's a lot of different ways that has happened. Some of that's in the regulation of the market, and then some of it is just through subsidies or benefits. And of course, the number one benefit or subsidy that's going on in the Texas market today is for renewable energy. And billions of dollars and billions of dollars have been poured into the Texas market to benefit generators who provide, well, in 2007 or so, wind produced about 3% of electric grid, the power on the electric grid in Texas, ERCOT. Today, that's up to about 25%, but they're getting paid these billions of dollars for really what's been a minority portion of the generation capacity on the market.
Well, and so what are the biggest examples then of that corporate welfare, crony corporatism? What are if you're going to tell me what the one or two or three things that are the biggest examples of that, or the worst abuses of that system? What are they?
Yeah, so they really come at three levels: the federal level, the state level, and the local level. And there's a lot of money involved in each one. Of course, the biggest one out there is the federal tax credits. There's the production tax credit for wind and the investment tax credit for solar powers. And that's been pumping billions of dollars into Texas for years now. Since about 2006, it's about $9 billion that has been coming into the Texas market through those subsidies. The next one.
So just to be clear, you're saying it's $9 billion in Texas alone, just for the PTC and the ITC.
Right, and then there was some money that came in right after the Great Recession through direct payments, because they were
the TARP program.
The TARP program, right?
And so that's included, and that's included in that $9 billion. Your estimate,
right?
Okay, gotcha.
And then in Texas, there's all kinds of subsidies here in Texas at the state level, but the biggest one is just the socializing transmission cost and the building of the CREZ lines. The CREZ lines, competitive renewable energy zone, although there's not much competitive about it, were built by a mandate of the Texas legislature back in 2005. The PUC adopted it, I think, around 2007 or 8. And then the building started, and they started coming online about 2011. But the whole purpose of the CREZ lines was to do nothing more than enable wind power to be built hundreds of miles away from the source, which, as you know, is a terribly inefficient thing to do when it comes to electric grids, and transmit wind power all the way across West Texas into the populated eastern part of the state. And so that's the second one.
Where Austin, Dallas, San Antonio, Houston are. And so you're saying that the building of that transmission line, and just to be clear, every ratepayer in the state pays for that, right? And it's about what, $5 a month, $4 a month, something like that?
I don't know the amount per month necessarily, but it's been $7 billion so far since they came online, about $7 billion total. And I think in 2020, the number is about $800 million that people are paying for. And of course, that's either sometimes a small electric.
$800 million a year that ratepayers are paying now to defease that. But the $7 billion, just to be clear, that was only the initial construction cost. You have maintenance and operation as well, right? Since then?
Well, the $7 billion, you're right. That was the overnight cost for just building it. But it's also about $7.2 billion today that consumers have actually been charged on their electricity bill. So that's added up, but it's going to go a long time. We estimate by 2029, consumers will have paid about $13 billion for the construction of these lines.
Now that's an interesting number, because I've asked the Powering Texas, there's a website run by the Wind Energy Association, to break down those numbers in terms of what the CREZ lines have cost. But that $13 billion, that's roughly the cost of the South Texas project when it was completed, which is the twin reactor project in Bay City that the city of Austin and San Antonio own parts of. But that project ended up costing about $13 billion. I just am making that connection because trying to give some comparison about, well, what is the expenditure here? But so why, I just want to stick on this issue of the state subsidy here for a moment.
Sure.
What did those CREZ lines deliver on, let me say, a very specific time, say 1:50 a.m. on February 15th? Were they delivering any power into the electric grid when the grid was about to fail?
Very, very little. If you add up the total of wind and solar, there's about 35 megawatts of capacity online.
Gigawatts.
I'm sorry.
35 gigawatts of wind and solar now in ERCOT.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
And only about 10% of that was actually functioning. Of course, solar was producing zero generation at that time, because for the simple reason that there was no sun.
Right.
And wind the turbines were frozen, or the wind wasn't blowing very hard. And so there wasn't much electricity coming from wind or solar at all at the critical moment when the PUC and ERCOT were shutting down the grid.
Right. So that 13 billion, now you're saying by 2029 will be the total bill. In 8 years, it'll be 13 billion. We're maybe at, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 billion now. But all of that money that was spent, then how much of that was valuable? I mean, truly valuable in terms of keeping the grid up and running when all of this catastrophe was unfolding. So was that, in your view, I'm going to ask the question, was that money well spent?
Well, no. I mean, it wasn't well spent. As a matter of fact, it wasn't. Not only was it not valuable, it was harmful, because if that money hadn't been spent, and if it hadn't been for the subsidies that we've had coming through state and federal and local levels, we wouldn't have any wind or solar at all on the grid. It just hasn't proven yet to be efficient, right? And they can't compete on price. The only way they can even be in existence today at a grid level, we're not talking about rooftop solar for people who want to do things at home. We're not talking about, on an island or in a place where you can't get power off the grid very easily, backup, those kind of things. But just on a grid for a major populated area, they can't compete on price. And we can see that because everybody acknowledges that. They won't really say it out loud, but they say, well, just wait till batteries come online. And we'll maybe get to that later, but just wait till batteries come online. Well, batteries cost even more money to put online. So you spend more money to make the contributions of wind and solar reliable, but they can't even do it at a cost that makes any sense. And so instead of all that, we would have natural gas generation built a lot closer to the people who need it. And we would have had probably enough power to keep the lights on that night. And if not, we would have had enough to maintain rolling blackouts where people were without power for maybe 30 minutes. And the disruption is less than what you get when your average thunderstorm, where the lights get knocked out because a tree takes out your power line and you're without power for a couple hours.
So if I'm hearing you right, I'm paraphrasing, but in Texas, there was 35 gigawatts of solar and wind in total. Almost the vast majority of that is wind. But was that malinvestment? How would you call that? How would you typify that in that spending? Was it was it well spent or not?
Malinvestment is a very good term. And the interesting thing is you don't see malinvestment on a widespread scale like this without some kind of government intervention, because no financier on Wall Street in his right mind would be throwing billions and billions of dollars at a industry that can't compete. The only reason they're doing it is to chase the subsidies. And I've seen numbers that estimate somewhere between 40 and 50% of the capital that goes into any wind or solar project is through subsidies, right? The benefits and the subsidies they get. And so that's a pretty good return on your investment. You put half the money in, and half of your return basically is coming from the government.
And it is guaranteed through the production tax credit or some other incentive that's out there.
Right.
So let me come back. I want to keep you on track. You said there are 3 different levels of subsidization. We talked about the federal level, PTC and ITC, the state level, which is the CREZ lines and the transmission capacity. And then you mentioned local. How does that play out in the local areas in Texas?
Well, it's really another tax credit. Here in Texas, we call it property tax abatements or limitations on property tax valuation, but it all works out the same. Basically, what happens is it's become its own cottage industry here in Texas. So you have, for instance, in the oil and gas industry, you have landmen, and they go out and they sign leases for people, say, I'd like to drill on your property. And if you give me your let me do that, I'll give you a certain percentage of the return, which is royalties on that. Well, the same thing is going on in the wind and solar business today. They have hired landmen, some unemployed landmen from the oil and gas industry, that type of thing. And they've scoured Texas today looking for any place where they can put together enough property to build a wind or solar farm and get the people to sign on to it. And the way they incentivize this whole thing is to get the local school districts and the local counties, because these things aren't usually built in cities. So counties and school districts are the main people they go to. And they say, look, we'd love to come build this wind farm in your area, but it's kind of expensive to do this. So if you'll give us a property tax abatement on our property, cut our property taxes over 10 years, the first 10 years of this project, we'll come do this and build this here. And so there's a big public hearing, except in a lot of cases, not many people show up because the notice on these public hearings at the local level are 72 hours. Now, sometimes the people find out about them beforehand, but all the negotiations generally take place in secret. Then they announce a hearing and then nobody shows up and they say, hey, great, nobody cares about this. It's because nobody knows about that. So anyway.
And to be specific, this is chapter 312 and 313. Is that the how they're described? Is that right?
Correct. Chapter 312, property tax abatements for counties, and 313 is for school districts. And so they hold these hearings and then they grant abatements, and then the wind farms come in or the solar farms come in and build these wind farms and solar farms all across Texas.
Well, I noticed in doing some of the preparation for our discussion that one of these last year, in fact, I saw it on, it was a clip on the Energy Alliance website. That's a reminder. Bill Peacock is the policy director at the Energy Alliance, which is a project of the Texas Business Alliance. And he's at there. You can see his stuff at energyalliance.com. I was just looking there about a chapter 312 and 313 abatement in Zapata County. Now, I'm not certain, but I'm assuming that Zapata County has a median household income below that of the statewide average, that these are generally lower income counties where these wind projects are going. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think most of these take place in rural Texas. I mean, all of them do, right? And
right.
Which is one of the amazing things. You have them building solar farms like in East Texas, which makes no sense. There's a lot more cloud cover and all that kind of thing. But instead of out in West Texas where you have sun, but they don't care where they build these things. All they need is enough property to get the federal credits and the local property tax credits. And so, I think they are lower income just because generally they're in areas where there's not a lot of population, and typically the rural areas in Texas are less wealthy than the metropolitan areas.
So let me play devil's advocate for just a minute here, Bill. And I'm sure you've heard some of these kinds of expressions before, but oh, well, you're just an oil and gas guy, or you're just opposed to renewables, or you don't care about climate change or the rest of it. How do you respond to that? Because that is generally the kind of the knee-jerk, the reflexive reaction to anyone who's criticizing these subsidies, that, oh, well, you're in the pay of, you name it, Chevron, Shell, all of the character. How do you reply to that?
Well, a couple of ways. One, I just say, look, let's talk about the facts. All my life, since I've been doing this at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for sure, and since then at the Energy Alliance, I've done research. And so I've written papers and I've taken the facts and I've put them on paper. And so the first thing I say is, okay, you can think what you want about me. You're no different than I am, though, because you maybe work in this industry or that industry, but let's put all that aside. Let's just look at my paper here and the facts on the paper. And if you have facts, bring them to me and let's go over the facts and we can talk about them. But I rarely see the folks who are critical of my work and the foundation's work and the Alliance's work ever want to do that, because they're not really serious when they criticize us for that. They're just trying to score rhetorical points. They don't really want to get to the bottom of things. So that's the first way I respond. Okay, let's sit down and look at the facts. And the second thing is that, it could be just possibly that I actually believe in liberty and freedom and free markets. And I'm motivated by seeking what the best way for people to live is through free markets and freedom of the choice, rather than corporate cronyism and big government regulation. And maybe that's my motivation rather than some payoff I might be getting, not that I'm getting any, from the oil and gas industry or anybody else.
But isn't that the knee jerk? I mean, you've heard this before, right? This kind of criticism.
Hundreds of times.
And it doesn't bother you?
No, like I said, let's sit down and look at the facts. I'm happy to go through them. And if I'm wrong, I'm happy to issue a correction.
So in terms of the total then, now I know you did a paper that I saw in 2019 for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. You're not there anymore. And then you've done some subsequent work for the Energy Alliance in which you've done some tabulations, some calculations on what are the payouts. So what are your calculations then in terms of the overall subsidies for renewables in Texas? Do you have those numbers at hand?
Yeah, $19 billion since 2006 is what's poured into Texas since that time.
And that's 19 billion in, and what does that consist of? How do you break that down?
Well, the state subsidies are like we talked about, the renewable energy,
the CREZ
lines. It's also the RPS program, the Renewable Portfolio Standard program in Texas. There's interconnection cost where they pay the interconnection cost onto the grid, those types of things. And then the big number you can't calculate at the state level is that the benefits that the renewable energy industry gets from not having to be online like everybody else does when they're needed, right? So everybody else gets in the Texas market, says, okay, if they, it's a complicated market, as most markets are. But the bottom line is most of the generators say, okay, we're going to be in the market tomorrow and we're going to supply this much energy, because they're looking ahead and they want to place in line. And if they don't step up the day before and say, we want to be there, they're not guaranteed a spot. And so they step up and say, we want to be there. And if they don't show up when they're needed, then they have to go find the energy somewhere else. If their plant breaks down, they have to go find the energy. Wind doesn't have to do that. They don't have to commit to be part of the market. They just show up when the wind starts blowing, or solar shows up when the sun is shining. They force everybody off the market or drive prices down because of their subsidies. And so that's a huge benefit that we can't calculate. But that's one of the subsidies at the state level. The federal level is the production tax credit and investment tax credit. That's $9 billion. And then the local property tax abatements, I calculate those about $1.1 billion since 2006.
So is it fair to say then that the wind and solar free ride on the existing generation that's already in the state? Is that what's the simplest way to describe that?
They're just riding their subsidies to the bank. Really, that's the way to put it. And they're driving the other companies out of business. I mean, one of the challenges we face today is we have fairly low reserve margins in Texas. Texas is the only state in the country and one of the only markets in the world where the government isn't telling you how much generation to build. And, but that sounds like a risky thing, but no government is telling, the industry how many computers to build, and nobody's telling us how many TV channels to have, and nobody's telling us how many lawnmowers to build or how many insurance policies we need to have. I mean, so it's the way the world works, but for some reasons, people have come to this idea that, the government needs to manage and control the electricity grid, or we're all going to wind up in the dark. Well, we've seen examples of how government control of the electricity grid has actually put people in the dark. It's happened down in California. It happens in New York on a regular basis. And now we've seen it happen in Texas, because as much as Texas does have a competitive electricity market, it's these policies we're talking about now, renewable energy subsidies and others, that really led to these blackouts. And so, what we need to do here is get rid of some of those kinds of things rather than increase them.
So I want to come back to the cures, because I want to leave that to the end of our discussion. Okay. But one of the things that to me is interesting is this issue of driving down the wholesale price. And I've seen a lot of discussion and I've written about it some, but why are you mentioned that solar and wind drive down the wholesale price of electricity. Now, if I'm a consumer, I'm thinking, well, a lower price, that's great. What's the problem with that? Why is driving down the wholesale price of electricity, and even sometimes driving it into a negative price, why is that a problem for the other generators that I'll call them the traditional generators in the market, the coal, gas, nuclear plants? Why is that a problem for them?
Well, we all love low prices, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And in fact, the market is always striving towards low prices. But that's not the only thing the market is striving for, because what they're ultimately striving for are consumers. Businesses can't sell their product unless they have somebody to sell it to. So they have to do their best to satisfy them. Sometimes that's with low prices. Sometimes that's with high quality. Sometimes that's with just a great reputation. I mean, like Amazon, for instance, people buy from Amazon all the time. It's not the low cost seller. It got in the marketplace because it was generally the low cost seller, a lot cheaper than the stores around you at home. But it's not the low cost seller today. You can go anywhere on the internet and generally find lower prices than you can at Amazon, but they have a reputation for quality and delivery and reliability. Well, so that's what the electricity market would be driving for too, right? Lower prices, and that's a good thing. However, when the lower prices come at the price of affordability, of reliability, that's a problem. And that's what we're seeing today. The subsidies are coming into the market and causing lower prices, but they're sacrificing reliability at the same time. And let me see if I can explain that to you. So,
well, I like that. I like that the low prices are actually they're reducing reliability. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, they're doing that because for the simple reason that the generators, wind and solar generators, get paid for essentially on a per kilowatt hour basis. They generate a kilowatt of electricity and they get paid for it. And so from the federal government, in addition to whatever they get on the market. And so, for instance, it's been various levels, but 2 cents per kilowatt hour is a good example. So the wind's starting to blow, the market's not very strong. Let's just say it's a mild, April day, 70 degrees outside, not a huge demand for electricity. And coal and nuclear and natural gas are generating, let's just say 90% of the electricity out there. Well, all of a sudden the wind starts to blow and wind starts ramping up to the place where it could put on 25% of the power onto the market. Well, what happens to those folks out there? Well, they have to compete for space on the transmission lines and who's going to be buying the electricity. Well, the way wind gets on the grid in those kind of times is it starts lowering its price and lowering its price and lowering its price. In theory, there's nothing wrong with that because that's the way markets work. But what gives wind the benefit or solar the benefit over these other ones is they're getting this per kilowatt hour subsidy. And so if they need to, they can actually go to the point to zero or below zero where they're actually paying people to take power off their grid. Let's say they're paying somebody 1 cent per kilowatt hour to take the power off of their wind farms. They're still making a marginal profit because they're getting 2 cents from the federal government. Well, some of the natural gas plants can shut down and just not have customers at that point in time. They said, we're not going to do that. We're losing money. But the coal and the nuclear can't do that because you just can't ramp them down and ramp them up. They have to stay online and they have to follow those prices down. And so they're actually losing money. Well, so two things to just bring out of that. One is that's driving these other companies out of business, or at least nobody's coming in to build these plants in Texas.
Right. Yeah, that was the key point because one of the things I've heard is because of the way the market is structured, that reliable generation sources like gas, that entrepreneurs aren't going to come into the Texas market because it makes no financial sense, or they can't get the financing to build it, even if they wanted to come in.
Right. Well, that goes back to what I said earlier: is the Wall Street's chasing the subsidies. Wind or natural gas, for instance, has the generation capacity in Texas grown 3.5% over the last 5 years, and almost next to nothing the last couple of years. In the meantime, wind capacity has increased by 113% during that period of time, and solar has increased by almost 2,000%. So you can see where the money's going. Wall Street and everybody else, they're chasing those subsidies, and it's not going into reliable generation, the kind of generation that was needed, as you talked about Monday night at 1 a.m. when the grid started to shut down.
So give me those numbers again. You're saying, so this is Texas installed capacity over the last 5 years or so?
Right. Yeah.
So 3.5% increase in gas fired generation, and wind was up how much?
113%, and solar is almost 2,000%.
Well, now you hit me close to home here, Bill, because I got solar panels on the roof of my house, right?
And that's great, right?
And I'm going to remind, I got 3 different subsidies for it. I have 8.5 kilowatts of solar capacity, and 6 months out of the year, I don't pay anything on my electric bill. So that's great. That's great for me. That's great for me. And I'm a selfish guy, I'm a selfish pig. But what does that mean if I'm not paying my, what would have been in the spring of $80, $90 electric bill, I'm, guessing, I'm not paying that same amount to Austin Energy. What does that mean for the barista at Starbucks?
What it means is I'm paying for it, right? Me, right?
Oh, you sucker.
Well, but that's what's going on. I mean, and that was the second point I wanted to get to is, you're not destroying the grid with your rooftop generation, but there's no reason I should be paying for it through tax credits. Well, when it looks at the industrial level, solar or wind, when the prices go down for it on the marketplace, the cost hasn't gone down. The cost that we're paying for wind and solar and energy overall hasn't gone down. It's just we're paying it through the back door through federal and state and local subsidies. So consumers don't save money when the prices go down on the electricity grid. It's just a reflection of how much we're paying on the back end.
In other ways that we're being paid through the subsidies. But let me just pursue that for just 1 second here, Bill, because in talking with what to me is interesting, kind of stepping back from Texas for a minute, is that it'd be one thing if California was just having blackouts and, those loony Californians, with their quinoa and, whatever, lots of people make fun of California. But there's a similar kind of animosity among the liberal states toward Texas. So now that this can't be just, this is just a one-off, or, it was cold weather, what have you. But if I'm buying fewer watt hours from the grid, is it one of the things that's apparent in California is that as their prices go up, more and more people are putting solar on their rooftops, and therefore the utilities are able to bill for fewer watt hours. So the cost of the grid is spread over a smaller number of watt hours that then is socializing the cost of the grid. Is that also in play?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think, there's nothing wrong with rooftop solar, but it is really expensive. I mean, it costs more to generate solar with a few panels on your rooftop than it does to build a natural gas plant 50 miles away from you and get it from there. As long as you spread those costs out over everybody. And so the thing with rooftop solar, distributed generation is generally what they use that term for. There may be a time when that is economical and affordable and makes sense, but it should make sense through the marketplace, not through the determinations of folks up in Washington, D.C. or folks over at Greenpeace or those kind of things, or the Texas Capitol. And they just say, hey, we need to do this stuff because it's going to save the world. And, and that gets us off into, global warming and those kind of things, which I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but we can, but that's what's driving all this. Although, before it was global warming driving things, it was global cooling. And before that, it was air pollution. And so people have always had this hatred towards the fossil fuel industry. And even though it's the most reliable and affordable source of energy out there, and by the way, wind and solar are the most mature, along with water, are the most mature sources of energy in the world. They've been being used for thousands of years, whereas coal and oil and natural gas really haven't become, you saw coal coming up in England and other places around 1200, but they really haven't been on an industrial scale for more than like 200 years or so. Oil and natural gas and nuclear are the new technologies here. There's a reason they pushed wind and solar off the grid, because those technologies don't really work well.
And when you say off the grid, and I remember in some of my research, I think it's Václav Smil traced the first windmills to somewhere in Persia in the 9th century, something like that. And solar was being used because of biomass. We were growing grass and feeding it to the oxen or the cows or whatever, and then using them or horses for draft animals. But I want to come back to I have one question I want to make sure I get into before I come back to the hydrocarbon question, but it's about this reaction right after the blackouts that said, don't blame wind, right? And we saw it in the national media, the local media, oh, it's not wind's fault. So put that in the hopper. But before you answer that one, I've been in journalism for more than 30 years. Years ago, I wrote things sort of critical of the oil and gas industry, and rightly so, because I saw some of the damage. Why is there such widespread loathing or disgust at the oil and gas industry? How do you attribute that, or what do you think that loathing and hatred comes from, particularly, and I'm going to use these words, coastal elites? Why do they hate them so much?
Well, I think ultimately it goes back to human nature, Robert. I think people are jealous and greedy, and they hate profit, at least when they're not sharing in it. And so you've seen it. It hasn't just been oil and gas over the years. There, lots of businesses that people hate. You go back, for instance, to Jews in the Middle Ages, right? When and they were a hated race. Why were they a hated race? Well, because they had discovered a way to be the intermediaries in a lot of ways, to bring products to market. This all started up in the 1300s, 1400s. In the rise of the Renaissance and merchant banking and those types of things, when we got off the feudal system, and they were one of the first ones to step in and say, look, we can be intermediaries. We can get these products to you and sell them to you then in a way nobody else can, much cheaper and better. But they also made a lot of profit. And they were the ones standing in front of everybody. You could see their wealth. You couldn't see the folks behind it. But of course, it wasn't Jews, gypsies and Armenians and others did the same thing very well. They also became hated folks. So I think really it's not so much about oil and gas. And I think most of the things we see today about, whether it's pollution, not that pollution hasn't been a problem, but it has been, but it continues to get better. Not just because of government regulation, but whether it's oil and gas or pollution or global warming or global cooling, whatever else, I think people are just looking for ways to take down others who are more successful than themselves, or are challenging them for leadership of society and the hierarchy.
And so it's about money and power. Right?
Money and power. Right.
Yeah, going back to those basic ideas. But is it also just a dislike of capitalism, the dislike of that system? Because I remember a few years ago, back when Exxon was making record profits, I remember very distinctly, it was a lead story on when Katie Couric, I'm pretty sure it was the lead on the evening news. ExxonMobil just reported, X zillion dollars, and they made 6,000 per second or something like that. And I thought, well, that's interesting. When did they ever do a similar comparison to Apple, whose profits on per unit of revenue are far greater than anything ever seen in the oil and gas industry? But it's something that I think is quite interesting, and it's something that, in the wake of the blackout, I'll just make this editorial comment here, is that I having been blacked out for 45 hours and also seeing this push to electrify everything, it's kind of radicalized me in thinking, no, some of these ideas are not just wrong, they're deeply dangerous, because they're going to make us more vulnerable to extreme weather that could in fact kill people. But again, that's just my observation. So back to the wind part of this. After the blackouts, I was stunned. I mean, and frankly, pretty impressed, I have to say, as somebody who's watched journalism for a long time, how many stories came out right after the blackouts that the message was all the same: don't blame the wind business. Why did we see all those stories? What was going on?
Yeah, I thought it was really funny. The first story I saw on this, because it all happens while we're asleep. Monday night, although my pipes start going off and just shaking wildly about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they wake me and my wife up, and we're trying to figure it all out. And
they're shaking because they're freezing, or what? I didn't understand.
I guess, I don't know. It took me 2 hours, but I finally figured out there was a faucet outside that I'd left dripping, and it was just barely dripping. I went outside, turned it off, and the whole system shut down. I mean, that's, the system didn't shut down. Everything stopped and everything was back to normal, and I couldn't figure it out. And we just had to have it fixed yesterday because the shaking was so violent that it dented the pipes, and it was just a little leak, and the plumber was out yesterday just to fix it. And so that's all going on while we're sleeping or waking up anyway. And then we get up Monday morning and it's white everywhere, and a lot of people don't have power. We had power. We live right around the corner from a nursing home, and apparently that saved us because, as you know, they're supposed to go through rolling blackouts, but the power loss was so great and the protected areas were so widespread that they couldn't do rolling blackouts for very long.
On critical networks. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And so that's a different matter. What's a critical network, and those types of things, are different issue. But anyway, so we wake up and so I'm looking at all this, and the first story I see on all this is about, I don't know, 1 or 2 o'clock in the Dallas Morning News. It's on
Monday on Monday the 15th. Yeah.
Monday the 15th, right? So right as this is all getting started, it's a Bloomberg report, and one of the headline it says, well, the subhead is that it looks like the winter storm caught the Texas deregulated market by surprise. Right? I mean, so it had already started, right? They were looking to blame markets. They were looking to blame competition. They were looking to blame Texas regulators, people getting fired, all those kinds of things. But from the very beginning, they wanted to make sure that we weren't blaming renewables.
And why?
Well, because it doesn't fit the narrative. Right? I mean, the narrative is that renewables are going to save the planet. Right? We are leading to a destruction of society and of the planet if we don't do something about global warming or global cooling or air pollution, whatever this current story is. And so we've got to shut down these use of fossil fuels. And in order to do that, we have to have everything electrified, to use your term, right?
Electrify everything, push.
Electrify everything. I'm still waiting to fly around in an electric airplane. I'm not quite sure how that works, but
the electric 737. Yeah.
Exactly.
Quite yet. Yeah.
but anyway, so that's the narrative, that we have to do this because it's saving the world and the planet. And therefore we can't blame these things we can't have anything come into the narrative that disrupts where we're going.
That might tarnish the green halo.
The green halo, correct.
Yeah. I'm sure I'm not the first one to use that line, but it's the one that just popped in my head.
I like it.
Whatever. Yeah. So who made the money? This is one of the other things that you've been following ERCOT now for a very long time, but the numbers that are thrown around frankly are staggering, right? And I've been writing a piece that I'm going to publish about what I think is clear, and I want to get to this as well, is that the state is going to somehow have to step in here. I just don't see any way that the state isn't going to have to come in and somehow backstop ERCOT. But where did the money go? I mean, the estimates that there was $55 billion worth of electricity that, in theory anyway, that was the headline number that was sold. Who made the money?
Well, we've talked about, when we talk about subsidies and everything, I mentioned that it's not just the renewable folks who are getting these things, and that's in fact the case. So when I first got engaged in this issue back in 2005 on the renewable issue, I was brought in and I started talking with generators. I got involved in this because the lieutenant governor's office actually called us at the foundation and said, hey, can you help us? The renewable industry is pushing to increase the RPS. Can you help us on that? And we said, sure. So we did the research. We looked at the numbers and say, this is a bad deal for Texas. The foundation hadn't done any research on it before, but it's pretty apparent pretty quickly that this was a problem. And so one of the
so if I can interrupt, so this would have been Bob Bullock was in office then?
No, David Dewhurst.
Oh, David Dewhurst. And so, and 2005, this would be around the time when the CREZ lines were also being discussed as well then.
It was the same session. The legislature gave, in 2005, they gave the PUC more authority over ERCOT. You saw how Deanne Walker, before she resigned during the testimony, she was saying that, well, we don't have that much authority over ERCOT in testimony in front of the Texas Senate, but she was wrong. They basically control everything they do over there. And that was the session where Texas...
The PUC controls everything at ERCOT.
Right. They don't do everything, but they're in charge of it.
Okay.
And so that happened in 2005. They authorized the CREZ lines in 2005, and they increased the RPS in 2005. And it was really, things were okay before that, but it's 2005, which was really the turning point that has led us to where we are today. So we got involved then, and one of the groups I went to for information to find out about all this was the generators, because they were concerned about all this. And so they gave me good information. And then I started finding out about the competitive Texas electricity market, like any other market in the world. And at the time, the left was attacking it because they hated things where consumers weren't protected, right? Of course, they're the ones who want to do the protecting through government. And so they were attacking the competitive nature of the market. And so I went to work trying to protect competition in the Texas market. And again, I got some information, helpful information. Always fact check it, just for the conspiracy theorists out there. But
sure,
from the generators and from other participants in the marketplace. But then about 2011 or so, all the benefits of the early market to the generators started evaporating, profits, because some of them had made bad bets on the market. As you recall, natural gas prices had skyrocketed during this time, in part because we had more competitive markets, not just in Texas, but across the nation. And there was a bigger demand for natural gas because of that. And the prices were skyrocketing. Well, you turn those prices for natural gas, you run them through the heat rate calculators, and they're making money hand over fist. And so they say, hey, this is going to go on forever. Making money hand over fist by turning that gas into electricity, right? Because the deregulated gas market enabled the deregulated electricity market, because they could get gas, build a power plant as on spec, right? Saying, we think we'll be able to sell this power, but it was based on price assumptions on natural gas that didn't turn out to be true. Right. Well, high prices, because as long as those prices stayed high, they could turn around and sell high cost electricity. But they wound up not doing that. And TXU was taken into the world's largest leveraged private buyout by I think it was KKR.
That's
and
right. So just to back up, so just this was the regulated market, which was Texas Utilities, which was known as TXU, but then it was one of the largest leveraged buyouts in American history by KKR.
Well, it wasn't
something like $40 billion or $50 billion, if I recall.
Right, and it wasn't regulated by that time, right? It was in the competitive market by that time. They had split into three companies, but they were still under one shell corporation. And so they went bankrupt because natural gas prices came down, electricity prices went down, they went bankrupt. And that happened to other people as well. And so the profits became a little tougher to come by. And all these Wall Street investors and and generators here in Texas who were rate of return regulated in most other places of the country, or had gotten into markets that were becoming capacity markets, they started getting a little shy on competition. And so they started coming into Texas and saying, we're not so sure about this energy only market, which is the name for the competitive market here in Texas, where the market rather than the state determines how much electricity is built, generation is built. And so they said, how about some subsidies? And this wasn't the renewable guys, this was all the big guys. And so really since 2011, they've been pushing this. They decided at that time to stop working with me because we were still pushing for competitive electricity. And so since about 2011, 12, 13, most of the generators in Texas have been pushing for subsidies. And so
by subsidies, you're saying capacity payments. They wanted some similar market structure that Texas didn't have. Texas and ERCOT have this energy only market. You only get paid for watt hours.
Right.
But they wanted a capacity payment to provide standby capacity, which is the standard in many other RTOs around the country. Am I right?
Correct. And
okay,
so
good.
In 2011, 12, they're actually pushing to change to a capacity market. They didn't get that, but they got the PUC to adopt this thing called the ORDC, the Operating Reserve Demand Curve, it basically creates an artificial demand curve for electricity in times of high demand. And so it was at a pretty low level, but in 2019, the industry was still pushing for this, and they got the PUC to increase the times that when the ORDC operates. And so in 2019, that actually increased wholesale electricity prices in Texas by $3.6 billion, which, we call it the $3.6 billion electricity tax on Texas. You don't see it on your bills anywhere. The legislature didn't vote for it. Even the PUC didn't vote for it. They just told their minions to go do this stuff, and consumers pay $3.6 billion more for electricity in 2019. We'll bring this back to a couple of weeks ago. And what you had was right that Monday we're talking about. Now we're in the afternoon. Prices are somewhere around, I've heard $1,200 per kilowatt hour to $2,000 per kilowatt hour
megawatt.
Megawatt hour. Yeah. Let me just pull up my phone here, and I can tell you right now, the prices in ERCOT today are at, let's see. Well, where I'm living right now, $14, West Texas, $5. So you can see that it's a little jump from $5 to $1,200 per megawatt hour. But that price wasn't high enough for the PUC on Monday, because they thought, ERCOT told them, however you want to look at it, that if we raise the price of electricity to $9,000, which is the max it can go in Texas, then that would bring more generation online. And so the PUC ordered ERCOT to totally ignore all the market constructs, all the mechanisms that have been built and fine-tuned for years and years and years, and raise prices from about $1,200 to $2,000, from about $1,200 per megawatt hour to $9,000. And it didn't help. We didn't see much, if any, more electricity come online. But for a couple of days, prices were trading at $9,000 per megawatt, and people were paying out the wazoo for it. And it's busting the system.
And that's where we got these estimates of $50 billion for that week of electricity, that was extrapolated out of those numbers. But you make a key point that it was one that Bill Magnus made during the ERCOT call on February 24th was, we raised the price cap and we saw no new generation come in, presumably because there wasn't any to be had. So was that, is that your answer then, so there were some generators that made out like bandits? This is where some of the money went, that they made hundreds of millions or billions of dollars then in those few hours or days. Is that right?
Yeah. The money, it's a wholesale price, $9,000 per megawatt hour. It goes to who's selling the electricity in the market. And for the most part, at that time, it was nuclear, coal, and natural gas. Wind and solar got some too. They were operating, but mostly it went to those folks.
So, but it was only if they were then selling into the spot market instead of
into the spot market, contract. Right? Yeah,
because Austin Energy has said customers shouldn't expect massive increases in their bills because they were buying electricity on fixed prices. That's what Austin Energy has said.
On a normal basis, day-to-day basis, somewhere probably in 80% of the electricity in Texas trades versus bilateral contracts. Austin Energy contracts with a generator out there, or ExxonMobil contracts with a generator, and they it goes through the market, but it's all on contract. But in times, but when electricity use is uncertain, so you need the spot market to operate, real-time market to operate to bring in electricity, because demand shifts or supply shifts. And that's what we're talking about here. But in this case, with so much down and so many commitments down, people not being able to come through, a lot more of the electricity traded through the real-time market and the auctions. And that's not everybody's going to be affected by that, but a lot of people are.
Right. And so that was presumably one of the exposures that Brazos Electric Cooperative had, and then therefore why they filed for bankruptcy, that they had to find power on the spot market. Okay,
Right.
so just a last couple of things, Bill, because we've been talking about an hour. And again, my guest is Bill Peacock, a friend of mine here in Austin. He's the first Austinite actually on Blackout Week here on the Power Hungry podcast. I've talked to Meredith Angwins in Vermont, Steve Bricks in Wisconsin, Lee Cordner's in California, J. Paul Oxer was in Houston, but I'm talking an Austinite, which is a good thing, and a very knowledgeable man about who knows about ERCOT for many years. So two last questions. Is the state going to have to bail out ERCOT? And second, and more importantly, I think, what happens next, or what should happen next? I know you're a proponent of free markets, but a lot of people are saying, no, there's going to have to be some more regulation here requiring on-site fuel, other things that are going to assure reliability and resilience. So yeah, take those in order if you don't mind.
Well, is the state going to bail out ERCOT? I don't know the answer to that. I have seen, we talked about earlier, KKR went bankrupt, billions and billions of dollars into bankruptcy. Nobody had to bail them out because the thing is they had generating assets on the ground that were valuable. And so they went bankrupt. They lost a lot of money, but people came in and bought that generation and it continued to work. So it's not clear to me that the state needs to bail out anybody. Now, what the state does need to do is to reverse the PUC's decision to bring generation up to $9,000 per megawatt hour. That was wrong. That was government intervention. And that's what caused a lot of the problems here. Right. So they shouldn't do that. And that kind of takes us to your next question is, how are we going to solve this problem? Let me tell you one quick story. So I wasn't without electricity for very long. A lot of people were without electricity for, a day and a half, maybe 2 days, something like that. But the real problem in Texas, particularly in Austin, was we were out without water. Right. And why were we without water in Austin? Well, it turns out that the plant in Austin, the largest water plant in Austin that produces about half the water for the people in Austin, ran out of power that same night we're talking about, Monday morning. And like all other water plants, they were supposed to have backup generation to keep the power going. And they did. But nobody at the plant was trained to know how to turn the backup generation on. And so they went for 3 hours plus waiting for Austin Energy to come in and do the work. In the meantime, the water levels are dropping rapidly because they can't get new water in, and everybody has their water faucets going during the night to keep it out. And so by the time they got the power back on, water levels were so low and water pressure was so on, they had to start shutting down the system.
Right.
So why do we think that turning the electricity grid more over to people like that is going to help solve any problems? It's just not going to. Right. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of the renewable subsidies. We can get rid of all the Texas subsidies. In Texas, we can't get rid of federal subsidies, but we can force renewable generation in Texas to pay for the cost they're imposing here in Texas by essentially making them pay for transmission, for interconnection, and for not showing up. Right? There's massive cost being imposed on the grid. We can make them pay for that. It's pretty simple how to do that. A lot of smart
require them to provide power when power is dear.
Right. If they want to be market participants, they don't have to, but if they don't want to obligate themselves that way, then they're not going to be guaranteed to be able to get on the grid, and lowering their prices won't help them at that point in time. Right. So you kind of put that construct into place. Then you change
the market rules. So if you're going to be a participant, you have to put in, for instance, a performance bond or something that says we will show up, and if we don't, we forfeit the bond, or something to that effect. I mean, you're talking about a regulation, and I know you like a light hand in regulatory issues, but you've got to have some big honking stick, right, to punish them if they don't deliver. Is that fair?
Well, again, it's not. I mean, yes, it's fair. I think though it's just like, there's rules for everybody. You just make wind and solar play by the same rules as everybody else is as a market participant. And it's a regulation only because the market is regulated by the state. There's no reason the grid needs to be operated by the government. It just happens to be. So that's it. Another thing you can do here in Texas is get rid of all these regulations that allow the PUC to do what it's been doing to deconstruct the market. And there's all kinds of antitrust regulations, market power abuse regulations that people are afraid of. And the funny thing is that most of these regulations are in place because the regulators and the state policymakers are afraid that the generators are going to make too much money. And so what happens when the generators start coming in and complaining that they're not making enough money? Well, the state just steps in and raises prices, either through the ORDC or just like the PUC did the other night. So they're making hash of the market. You need to get the PUC out of the business and let the market handle itself.
So you think that ultimately, and I guess this is always the challenge, and what my own bias has been, there was a misunderstanding of the grid and the importance of the grid, that this idea, you could sell electricity just like hamburgers or tortillas. Well, it's not a hamburger, it's not a tortilla, it's a critical service, right? So it has to be handled in a different way. But you're saying that if the incentives are right, that the government can still reduce the mandates if the rules are properly constructed, so it's a level playing field. Is that a fair recounting of what you're trying to say, or
Sure.
am I making a hash of it?
Well, let's step away from tortillas and hamburgers and just look at food generally for a second. So think about New York City, right? I used to work in agriculture and went up to New York City one time. There's enough food on Manhattan Island to survive for about 4 or 5 days.
Okay.
Right? And after stocked in for people to buy. After that, it's gone.
Right.
And then people would start starving to death pretty soon after that, after they go through their cabinets. Nobody is mandating the grid that delivers all that food to New York City. It's just as complicated and just as important and just as the electric grid is. Nobody's mandating how that works. It just works because people have figured out how to do that. I think you could see the same thing happen with the electricity grid. And actually, we have seen that occur in Texas. And so I'm not just making this stuff up, fantasizing about it. We've actually seen it work in Texas. What we've seen the last few weeks is because that wasn't allowed to work. And realistically, because we had a record storm here. The state meteorologist said that it's probably the 3rd or 4th worst storm in Texas history, but from variance from norm, it's the worst storm ever because it was late in the season. And so you put that together with all these subsidies and market interventions, and that's what caused this to happen.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, good. Well, Bill, we've been talking an hour and I don't want to keep you. I know you have other obligations today, but this has been great. I mean, you've really provided to me, and I've been looking at these issues for a while as well, but a better breakdown of the incentives, federal tax incentives being one of them, that ended up in distorting the market and leading in part to this catastrophe, which it is a catastrophe that is going to continue to play out in the weeks and months to come. So my guest again is Bill Peacock. He's the policy director at the Energy Alliance, which is a project of the Texas Business Council. You can read some of his work at theenergyalliance.com. Bill, thanks a million for being on the podcast. I sure appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thanks. And to all you in podcast land, give us 10, 12, 45 stars, whatever is available on your local podcast outlet. That'd be great. And until then, I think this is the last episode of Blackout Week on the podcast. But I'm sure we'll be talking about some of these issues more in the future. But until the next episode, thanks for tuning in. And then I'll see you next time.